When did you realize your dad would rather be right than keep you alive? I was at home when my little sister sent me a screenshot of a weather warning. Tornado alert. Take shelter immediately. In the next message, she said, Dad won't let me leave my bed. My blood went cold. Halsey was at Dad's house for her court-mandated weekend. The same house where he'd locked me in my room during a flood warning 2 years ago. I called her immediately. Wind was howling in the background. Arthur? Her voice was shaking. Dad says I'm being dramatic. Where are you right now? My bedroom, 2nd floor. He told Janet to make sure I don't leave. 2nd floor, the worst possible place during a tornado. You need to get to the basement. Now. I tried. Janet's standing in the hallway. She said if I leave my room, they'll tell the judge I'm defiant. I pulled up the radar. The tornado was 18 minutes out, heading straight for them. Category F3. Put me on speaker and go anyway. I can't. Last time I disobeyed, Dad got my visitation extended by 2 months. I called Dad. No answer. I called Janet. Straight to voicemail. Halsey, I'm calling 911. I dialed. My 14-year-old sister is locked in a 2nd floor bedroom during a tornado warning. Address is 4782 Bird Ridge Drive. Is she home alone? No, her father won't let her take shelter. Sir, we can't intervene in custody situations. This isn't about custody. There's an F3 tornado heading for that house. If the adults in the home aren't concerned... I hung up and called Mom. She was in California for work. Mom, Dad won't let Halsey take shelter. There's a tornado. I'm calling my lawyer right now. A lawyer? Mom, she needs help now. I can't do anything from here. I'll call the police. I already did. I called Dad's neighbor, Mr. Squelch. Please, you have to help. Halsey's locked in her room. I'm not getting involved in Dan's family business again. Last time I tried to help you kids, he threatened to sue me. She could die. That's between you and your father. I called Dad's brother, Uncle Mike. Arthur, you know I can't undermine Dan's parenting. This isn't parenting, Halsey texted. The lights just flickered. I'm scared, Arthur. I called Dad again. This time he answered. What? There's a tornado coming. Get Halsey to the basement. Arthur, I'm not falling for another one of your mother's manipulations. Halsey's fine. Check the weather. Check any weather site. I don't need to. This is just another attempt to disrupt my custody time. Dad, please. He hung up. Halsey called me back. Arthur, I can see it. My heart stopped. What? Out my window, and it's huge. It's black. The trees are going sideways. Break the window and jump if you have to. It's 2 stories. Halsey, get out. Janet's in the hallway. She won't move. I called 911 again. The tornado is at the house. My sister can see it. Sir, all emergency vehicles are in shelter protocol. Send someone. We cannot send units into an active tornado. I heard Halsey scream, then a sound like a freight train, then glass breaking. Halsey! The windows! She was sobbing. They're all breaking! Daddy! Daddy, help! I heard Dad's voice in the background. Get back in your room. The windows are gone! Stop being dramatic! The sound was deafening now. I heard things crashing, Halsey screaming, then a horrible crack. Arthur! Her voice was different, weaker. The roof is... The line went dead. For 13 minutes, I called everyone. Dad's parents, his neighbors, even his workplace security to see if someone could check. Finally, someone answered Dad's phone. But it wasn't Dad. This is Paramedic Johnson. Who is this? Where's my sister? Halsey? 14 years old, blonde hair? We're transporting multiple victims. Are you family? Yes. Is she okay? Son, you need to get to Regional Medical Center. I drove 97 miles per hour, got there in 45 minutes. Halsey was in surgery. The roof had collapsed onto her bedroom. Dad was in the waiting room with a Band-Aid on his forehead. Where were you? I screamed at him. In the basement. We called for Halsey, but she wouldn't come. You locked her upstairs. That's a lie. We told her to come down and she refused, just like her mother taught her. Always defiant. Janet nodded. She wanted to make a scene. We have it on video, us in the basement calling for her. You filmed yourselves after the tornado. Prove it, Dad said coldly. I just smiled and responded with bet. Not because I had any evidence, I didn't. But because I was finally ready to destroy him in the same way he destroyed me and Halsey. He was going to learn just how fragile his relationship with Janet really was. I pulled out my phone and started recording, keeping it low against my leg while Dad sat there scrolling through his own phone like nothing happened. Janet was checking her makeup in a compact mirror, fixing her lipstick while my little sister was somewhere in this building getting cut open. The Band-Aid on Dad's forehead was the only sign he'd been anywhere near that tornado, and even that looked like it was placed there for show. I angled my phone to catch both of them in frame, making sure to get the clock on the wall that showed it was barely an hour since Halsey got pulled from the rubble. My hands were shaking, but I kept recording, watching Dad yawn and stretch like he was waiting for an oil change instead of news about whether his daughter would live or die. I texted the video to Mom with a message to save it to her cloud immediately, because I was building a case whether anyone helped me or not. The triage nurse came through the double doors and my heart jumped, but her face told me this wasn't good news. She said Halsey was still in surgery and they'd found internal bleeding that wasn't showing up on the initial scans. Dad stood up and started demanding to know who authorized additional procedures without his consent. His voice got louder with each word, asking if they knew he was a paying customer with excellent insurance and threatening to speak to the hospital administrator. I stepped between him and the nurse before he could get any closer, feeling my whole body tense up like I was ready for a fight. The nurse backed away and said she'd get someone to explain the situation better, then disappeared through the doors before Dad could follow. A woman in a navy blazer appeared about 10 minutes later, introducing herself as Veronica Rios, the hospital social worker. She had this calm way of talking that made it clear she wasn't going to be pushed around. She handed us each a business card and explained that given the circumstances of Halsey's injuries, the hospital had certain protocols to follow. Dad started arguing about hospital overreach and how this was a private family matter, but Veronica just nodded and kept that same steady expression. She said all family communication would go through her from now on to ensure Halsey's best interests were protected. While Dad ranted at Veronica about knowing his rights and having lawyers on speed dial, I slipped out to the parking lot. The air still smelled like rain and destruction, with debris scattered across the asphalt. I sat on the hood of my car and started making a timeline on my phone, typing out every single thing that happened from the moment Halsey texted me. I screenshotted the weather alerts showing the exact time the tornado warning was issued. Then I went through my call logs and took screenshots of every call, especially the ones where Dad hung up on me. I found the radar images from the weather service and saved those too, showing the tornado's path directly over Dad's house at 4782 Bird Ridge. My fingers moved fast across the screen, documenting everything while it was fresh in my mind. Back in the waiting room, some of Dad's relatives had shown up, probably called by Janet. Dad immediately started his performance, talking loud enough for everyone to hear about how Halsey had always been dramatic and rebellious, just like her mother. He shook his head sadly and said she refused to come downstairs even when they begged her. I hit record again on my phone, keeping it casual like I was just texting. Dad went on about how they called and called for her, but she wanted to prove a point. When he mentioned their video proof, I watched Janet shift in her seat and look down at her hands. She kept glancing at her phone, then back at Dad, like she was checking something. Dr. Ahmad Kramer finally came out after what felt like forever, still in his surgical scrubs with spots of blood on them. He explained that Halsey had a collapsed lung, 3 broken ribs, and a serious head injury that required emergency surgery to relieve pressure on her brain. Dad immediately started questioning every decision, asking why they didn't wait for his consent and demanding to know Ahmad's credentials. Ahmad stayed completely calm and said every second mattered in trauma cases, and consent wasn't needed for life-saving treatment. He said Halsey was stable but critical, and they'd moved her to the ICU. Dad wanted to know when he could see her, and Ahmad said family visits would be coordinated through the social worker. I stepped outside to call Mom, and she answered on the first ring, already crying before I could say anything. I told her Halsey made it through surgery, but it was bad. Really bad. Mom said she was trying to get a flight, but everything was grounded because of the storms. She mentioned her lawyer was already working on emergency custody paperwork, but we both knew that wouldn't help right now. The ICU wouldn't care about paperwork when Halsey was hooked up to machines just trying to stay alive. Veronica found me in the hallway and asked if we could talk privately. She led me to a small conference room and closed the door. She explained that she'd already contacted CPS and a report had been opened. The caseworker's name was Joanna Pennington, and she'd want to interview everyone separately. Veronica told me to document everything I remembered while it was fresh, write down names, times, everything. She said this quietly but firmly, like she was giving me instructions for battle. Later that night, I sat in my car with my laptop and submitted a FOIA request to the county for the 911 recordings from tonight. I knew it would take weeks to get them, but I needed proof that I tried to get help while Dad did nothing. I started a detailed document with timestamps of every call, every text, every single interaction from the last 18 hours. Dad was still in the waiting room putting on a show for his relatives, talking about being a concerned father and how hard this was for him. But I kept watching Janet and noticed she kept looking at her phone, then at Dad with this nervous expression. She knew their story had holes and she was scared. That's where I'd apply pressure when the time came. Veronica came back around 11:30 with 2 hospital security guards behind her. She looked at Dad, and then at me, and said the hospital was arranging separate waiting areas for family members due to the high emotion situation. Dad jumped up from his chair and started yelling about his parental rights and how nobody could keep him from his daughter. The security guard, a big guy with tired eyes, stepped forward and made it real clear this wasn't up for debate. Dad kept arguing, but they walked him and Janet down the hall to another waiting room, while Veronica stayed with me. She sat down and pulled out some forms, explaining that the hospital had protocols for situations like this, where family conflict might affect patient care. I watched through the glass doors as Dad gestured wildly at the security guard down the hall. About an hour later, Ahmad came back still in his scrubs, but with fresh blood spots on them. He sat down across from me and explained that Halsey's brain was swelling from the trauma, and she needed another surgery right away to relieve the pressure. Dad must have seen Ahmad talking to me because he came storming back with the security guard trying to keep up. Dad demanded a second opinion and said nobody was touching his daughter without his permission. Ahmad stayed calm and told him that any delay could be fatal, and they were proceeding with or without consent under emergency protocols. Dad turned to me and said this was my fault for creating drama. I stood up and told him if he tried to block this surgery, I'd make sure every single person in this town knew he was endangering Halsey for the second time tonight. The security guard moved between us and Dad backed down, but his face was red and his hands were shaking. They took Halsey back into surgery, and I sat in that plastic chair for 6 more hours. Mom kept calling every 30 minutes from the airport in California where she was still stuck. Dad and Janet were back in their separate waiting room, but I could hear him on the phone with someone, probably his lawyer. I tried to eat something from the vending machine but couldn't swallow. Around 7 in the morning, Ahmad finally came out looking exhausted. He explained that the surgery went well, and Halsey was stable but critical. They'd moved her to the ICU where machines were helping her breathe. The roof beam that hit her had caused massive trauma to her skull and spine. He said it was miraculous she survived at all given where the rescue team found her in the debris of her bedroom. Dad tried to ask questions, but Ahmad said he'd already explained everything necessary and walked away. I followed Ahmad down the hall and thanked him. He stopped and looked at me for a long moment before saying that in 20 years of trauma surgery, he'd never seen injuries quite like this from someone who was supposedly free to move around during a tornado. That night around midnight, my phone rang with a blocked number. It was Joanna Pennington from CPS introducing herself and saying she needed to schedule an interview with me first thing in the morning. She told me to preserve all digital communications with Dad, Janet, and anyone else involved in tonight's events. She said the case was being fast-tracked given how serious Halsey's injuries were. I asked if she'd seen cases like this before, and she said yes, but rarely with such clear documentation. After hanging up with Joanna, I called Mr. Squelch again. He answered on the 5th ring, sounding annoyed. I asked him one more time about security cameras, and he said he didn't have any. But then he paused and said something about hearing Dad yelling at someone to get back in their room right before the tornado hit. He hung up before I could ask more questions. I couldn't sleep in that hospital chair, so I opened my laptop and started creating a timeline. Every call, every text, every second of that night. I downloaded all my phone records and organized them by timestamp. I transcribed every conversation I could remember word for word. I wasn't going to win this with anger even though I wanted to destroy him. I needed facts and documentation and witnesses who would eventually crack under legal pressure. By 5 in the morning, I had 12 pages of timeline with supporting evidence linked to each entry. The next morning, a different security guard found me in the hallway taking pictures of the ICU entrance. He said Dad had complained about privacy violations and asked me to stop recording. Veronica showed up within minutes and negotiated a compromise where I could document anything in public areas, but not private conversations without consent. The guard seemed satisfied and walked away. I went back to my chair and checked my email. The National Weather Service had sent an automated response to my inquiry with an attached PDF. It confirmed the exact time the tornado warning was issued for Dad's address and when the F3 touched down at that location. The timestamps matched perfectly with when Halsey called me terrified from her room. I forwarded everything to Joanna and Mom's lawyer. Later that morning, Dad tried to have me removed from Halsey's visitor list. He marched up to the ICU desk with Janet and told the nurse that I wasn't Halsey's legal guardian and Mom had given up her rights by being absent. The nurse looked confused and called Veronica. When Veronica arrived, she explained to Dad that siblings have certain rights regardless of custody arrangements. She also mentioned that trying to isolate an injured minor from family looked suspicious given the circumstances. Dad stormed off, but not before telling me this wasn't over. I spent the afternoon calling the city about getting a building inspector to look at Dad's house. After getting transferred 4 times, I finally reached someone who understood what I needed. The inspector agreed to expedite an assessment report that would show which rooms took the direct hit and how the structure collapsed. The next morning, I walked to the nurse's station and asked for the contact info of the paramedic who found Halsey. The nurse shook her head and pointed to a door down the hall marked Legal Department. I knocked, and a tired woman behind a desk told me all witness statements had to go through proper channels and handed me a form that was 8 pages long. I filled it out right there in her office, documenting every single attempt to get help for Halsey, knowing that paper trails mattered more than anything else in situations like this. 20 minutes later, Joanna showed up and led me to a small conference room that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. She pulled out a recorder and asked me to start from the beginning, not just about the tornado, but about every single time Dad had locked us in rooms during emergencies. I told her about the flood warning 2 years ago when he made me stay in my bedroom while water rose in the basement, about the time he wouldn't let me leave during a gas leak, because he thought the fire department was overreacting, about how he always said safety warnings were just the government trying to control people. She wrote everything down in neat handwriting and asked if I had any photos or documents from those times. I pulled up old text messages on my phone where I'd begged Mom to pick me up early from Dad's house during the flood, screenshots I'd saved just in case I ever needed them. Detective Leo Watkins arrived while we were still talking. a tall guy with gray hair who introduced himself and explained that what started as a custody issue was now a criminal investigation because of how badly Halsey was hurt. He sat down with his own notebook and went through my entire statement again, asking specific questions about times and locations and who said what when. He was careful not to show any emotion, but I could tell he was taking this seriously by how many follow-up questions he asked. After he left, Ahmad found me in the hallway and asked if we could talk privately. We went to an empty waiting room where he explained that Halsey's spinal cord was swollen from the impact, and she might not be able to walk for a while, maybe months, maybe longer. The medical bills were already over $200,000, and climbing every day she stayed in the ICU. He mentioned carefully that insurance companies look at fault when deciding what to cover, and having clear documentation about why she was in that room when the roof collapsed could make the difference between coverage and bankruptcy. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the hospital cafeteria with my laptop, organizing everything into folders for Joanna. Screenshots of weather alerts with timestamps, recordings of my calls to 911, the timeline I'd made that first night, names and phone numbers of every single person I'd contacted for help. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud drive and sent her the link. She texted back saying it was the most organized evidence package she'd ever gotten from a family member and that it would help move things along faster. That evening I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw it. Dad had posted a long message about being a devoted father, going through the worst tragedy of his life, asking for prayers and support during this difficult time. The comments were full of people who didn't know what really happened, telling him how strong he was and offering to bring meals. I took screenshots of everything, including the timestamp that showed he posted this while Halsey was still in surgery fighting for her life. The next day, I saw Janet sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria staring at her phone. I walked over and sat down across from her, keeping my voice quiet and calm. I mentioned that obstruction of justice carried a 5-year sentence and child endangerment could add another 10, especially when it resulted in serious injury. Her face went white and she grabbed her purse and left without saying a word, but I knew I'd gotten through to her. The seed was planted that protecting Dad meant she could lose everything too. Later that afternoon, the patient advocate found me and suggested that since Mom couldn't get here from California, she could sign papers giving me temporary medical power of attorney for Halsey. It wasn't custody, but it would mean I could make decisions about her care and get full access to her medical records without having to go through Dad. Mom agreed immediately and the paperwork was faxed over within an hour. Mom's lawyer called me that night saying they were filing an emergency motion with family court to remove Dad's custody based on the CPS investigation. They needed an affidavit from me describing everything that happened, and Joanna helped me write it using the specific language judges need to see. We spent 2 hours making sure every single fact was correct and properly documented, because one mistake could give Dad's lawyer something to attack. The next morning, Joanna interviewed Dad and Janet separately in different rooms at the hospital. I watched from down the hall as Dad came out of his interview with his face bright red, slamming the door behind him. Janet's interview went on for almost 2 hours, and when she finally came out, she looked like she'd been crying. Joanna walked out behind her carrying 2 phones and evidence bags and told them both not to delete anything from their cloud accounts or social media. Dad started yelling about privacy rights, but Joanna just smiled and said preservation of evidence was standard procedure in cases involving injured minors. Leo called me an hour later saying he'd gotten something interesting from the neighbor's security footage. He drove over to the hospital to show me on his tablet, and there it was in black and white. The timestamp showed 7:43 p.m. when the tornado was clearly visible approaching the house. No movement from inside, no lights turning on, nothing until 7:58 p.m. when Dad and Janet finally ran to the basement. 15 whole minutes after the tornado was already on them. Leo said the neighbor had refused to help me directly, but cooperated with police once they showed up with a warrant. I took photos of the screen with my phone, while Leo explained how this proved nobody tried to help Halsey until it was too late. Veronica pulled me aside after Leo left and told me I needed to be careful about contacting Janet again. She said the way I'd approached her in the cafeteria could be seen as witness tampering if Dad's lawyer found out. I promised to let the professionals handle it from now on, understanding that legal pressure would work better than my threats anyway. She patted my shoulder and reminded me that building a solid case took patience, not anger. The next morning, I got an email response to my FOIA request for the 911 recordings. They said it would take 4 to 6 weeks to process because of the disaster backlog from the tornado. I wanted those recordings so bad, but had to focus on what we could get right now instead of waiting for perfect evidence. Ahmad found me in the waiting room and asked if I wanted to see something important. He took me to a small office and pulled up Halsey's imaging scans on the computer. The pictures showed her skull and spine in weird blue and white patterns that made my stomach turn. He pointed to specific areas and explained how the injury pattern showed she was lying flat in bed when the ceiling came down. The angle of impact and force measurements proved she wasn't standing or trying to escape when it happened. He said this medical evidence would be really important for showing she was following Dad's orders to stay in bed. I thanked him and took notes on everything he explained, knowing this could destroy Dad's story about Halsey refusing to come downstairs. 3 days passed with me spending every moment at the hospital, only leaving to shower at home and grab clean clothes. I was walking to my car in the parking garage when Dad appeared from behind a concrete pillar. He blocked my path and started saying I was destroying our family over nothing. His face was red and his fists were clenched as he threatened to sue me for defamation. I kept my phone recording in my pocket while he made these weird threats about what happens to people who cross him. He said I'd regret turning Janet against him and that Mom had poisoned my mind just like she'd done with Halsey. I stayed calm and didn't respond to any of his threats, just kept walking toward my car while he followed me yelling. When I finally got in my car and locked the doors, he stood there staring at me through the window for a full minute before walking away. I immediately sent the recording to both Joanna and Leo, who called me within minutes saying I shouldn't be alone with Dad anymore. They set up a safety plan where hospital security would make sure we were never in the same area without supervision. The security guard started checking on me regularly and made sure Dad stayed in his designated waiting area on the other side of the hospital. Leo came by again the next day with more evidence from his investigation. He'd analyzed the emergency radio traffic from that night and found proof that multiple units had responded to my 911 call. They all wanted to help, but couldn't deploy because of the active tornado touching down. This showed I'd tried everything possible to get help, while Dad did absolutely nothing. Leo said this would be important for showing the difference between my response and Dad's complete lack of action. Uncle Mike showed up to visit Halsey that afternoon, and I stayed quiet in the corner recording while he talked to another relative. He started going on about how Dan had always thought weather warnings were just government overreach trying to control people. He said Dan never evacuated for anything, and made fun of people who took warnings seriously. This pattern of dismissing safety warnings would help establish Dad's negligent mindset, so I made sure to get every word on my phone. Uncle Mike saw me when he was leaving but didn't say anything, just shook his head and walked out. Later that night I was scrolling through Facebook when I found something huge. Janet had made a public comment during the tornado on someone else's post about her phone dying and being scared. The timestamp was 7:51 p.m., right in the middle of when they claimed to be calling for Halsey from the basement. I screenshotted everything and forwarded it to Joanna, who texted back that this was exactly the kind of evidence that could break their story apart. She added it to the growing file of proof that Dad and Janet were lying about what really happened. The next morning, Joanna called to tell me she was implementing an emergency safety plan for when Halsey woke up. Dad would only get supervised visits from now on, meaning he couldn't be alone with her or try to influence what she said about that night. It wasn't full custody removal yet, but it meant Halsey would be safe from him trying to pressure her into changing her story. 2 days passed before the nurse called me into Halsey's room, saying she was showing signs of waking up. I rushed in and found her eyes barely open, her fingers moving slightly on the white hospital sheets. I grabbed her hand and felt her squeeze back weakly while the monitors beeped around us. She tried to speak but only managed to whisper so quiet I had to lean close to hear it. "Hallway," she said, just that one word. I asked if Janet was blocking her path and she squeezed my hand harder, her eyes getting wet with tears. The nurse documented everything while I held Halsey's other hand and watched her drift back to sleep. That afternoon, Joanna set up a meeting with a legal aid lawyer at the hospital who spread out papers on the conference table. She explained how hearsay rules worked and which evidence would count in court versus what wouldn't matter at all. She showed me how to document things properly with dates and times and signatures from witnesses who saw things happen. She taught me about chain of custody for physical evidence and how to make sure nothing could be thrown out on technicalities. The next morning, Dad showed up with his lawyer carrying a laptop and demanding to show everyone his proof video. Leo took the laptop and plugged it into the conference room screen while Dad stood there looking smug. The video showed Dad and Janet in the basement calling for Halsey, but Leo pulled up the file properties on screen. The metadata showed the video was created at 8:47 p.m., a full hour after the tornado had passed through the area. Leo printed out the metadata sheet and added it to his evidence file while Dad's face turned red. His lawyer tried to argue the timestamp could be wrong, but Leo explained how digital forensics worked and why timestamps couldn't be faked that way. I spent that afternoon at the Weather Service office downtown, getting official reports about the tornado's path. The meteorologist showed me debris scatter patterns on his computer that proved the second-floor bedrooms took the direct hit. He printed out technical diagrams showing wind speeds and impact zones that made it clear anyone in the basement would have known the danger upstairs. He signed an affidavit stating the basement remained mostly intact while the upper floors were destroyed. Later that evening, Veronica texted me that Janet had approached her privately in the hospital cafeteria. Janet had asked about whistleblower protections and what would happen if someone remembered things differently than they first said. Veronica stayed neutral, but made sure Janet understood cooperation agreements and how they worked with prosecutors. She told Janet that people who came forward early got better deals than those who kept lying until the end. Through Veronica, I made sure word got to Janet about the difference between child endangerment charges and attempted murder charges. The message was simple, but clear that cooperation would determine if she was seen as another victim or as someone who helped hurt a child. Veronica made sure Janet knew that prosecutors looked at intent and that following orders wasn't always a defense. 3 days later, Halsey woke up for a longer stretch, and Veronica brought in recording equipment. I sat next to Halsey's bed holding her hand while she told us everything in a weak but steady voice. She said Janet stood in the hallway with her arms crossed while Dad screamed at her to stop being dramatic. She remembered Janet saying she had to follow Dad's rules or there would be consequences for everyone. Halsey's voice broke when she described hearing the tornado getting closer and begging Janet to move. Veronica documented every word on the official forms while I kept holding Halsey's hand. That same afternoon, the ICU nurse pulled Leo aside, and I overheard her explaining something about Halsey's injuries. She said the debris pattern in Halsey's wounds showed she was lying flat when the roof came down on her. The angle of impact and the way the injuries lined up proved she was in bed like she'd been ordered to stay. Leo took photos of the medical charts and got the nurse to write out her observations for the file. The next day, Joanna called to say she was filing an emergency motion with the family court. She'd gathered all our evidence into a thick folder that she said painted a clear picture of what really happened. The hearing was set for next week with Judge Mayer, who everyone said took child safety more seriously than anything else. Joanna warned me that Dad would probably lawyer up hard once he got the court papers. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got an envelope from a law firm with a cease and desist letter inside. Dad's lawyer wrote that I was making false allegations that were damaging his client's reputation and threatened legal action. I took it straight to the legal aid clinic where the lawyer helped me write a response. We kept it simple and said we were only reporting facts to the proper authorities as required by law. She made copies of everything and told me to document any other contact from Dad or his lawyer. The whole time this was happening, I kept visiting Halsey and watching her slowly get stronger. She could stay awake for longer periods now and even managed to eat some ice chips. The bruises on her face were turning from purple to yellow and green, but she was starting to look more like herself. Dad tried to visit once, but security turned him away since the supervised visit order meant he needed advanced scheduling. He stood in the hallway yelling about his rights until security threatened to call the police. 2 days later, Joanna called to tell me Janet had reached out wanting to clarify her earlier statement. Janet showed up at the CPS office with her phone and handed it over without being asked. She sat there for 3 hours going through every text and photo from that night. Joanna recorded the whole meeting while Janet pointed out messages she'd sent during the tornado, saying she was scared and wanted to go to the basement. Leo took Janet's phone and established a proper chain of custody with evidence tags and signatures. He pulled up her text history from that night and found messages to her sister at 8:47 p.m. saying Dad wouldn't let them leave the second floor. Another text at 8:52 p.m. said she could hear the tornado and was terrified. At 8:54 p.m. she wrote that Halsey was crying and begging to go downstairs, but Dad said no. These timestamps matched exactly with when I was on the phone with Halsey hearing her plead to leave her room. Leo printed everything and had Janet initial each page confirming these were her actual messages. Ahmad called me that afternoon to say he'd prepared a medical affidavit for the court. He walked me through the technical details of how debris impacts the human body at different angles. The pattern of Halsey's injuries showed she was lying flat on her back when the ceiling came down. The bruising on her arms indicated she'd raised them to protect her face while in bed. The angle of the broken ribs proved she wasn't standing or moving when hit. Ahmad's statement was 8 pages of medical facts that no one could argue with. Mom flew back from California, and her lawyer met us at a conference room downtown. The lawyer spread out all our evidence on a big table and started organizing it into exhibits. She made me practice my testimony over and over until I could say it without getting angry. Every time I started to show emotion, she'd stop me and make me start again. She said judges need facts, not feelings. We went through every single minute of that night with me explaining what happened while she took notes. She showed me how to answer questions with just the facts and not add opinions. We practiced for 4 hours straight until I could tell the story calmly, no matter what questions she threw at me. The next morning, Joanna brought a child psychologist to the hospital to take Halsey's formal statement. Halsey was stronger now and could sit up in bed for longer periods. The psychologist explained they would record everything for the court. Halsey looked at me, and I squeezed her hand to let her know she was safe. She told them how Dad ordered her to stay in bed when the tornado sirens started. She described Janet standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, blocking the path. She remembered Dad yelling that weather warnings were just government fear tactics. She said she begged Janet to move, but Janet said she had to follow Dad's rules. Halsey's voice stayed steady, even when she described hearing the tornado getting closer. She told them about calling me and how I tried to help, but no one would listen. The psychologist asked gentle questions, and Halsey answered each one clearly. When they finished, Halsey had given 40 minutes of testimony that destroyed Dad's story completely. The emergency hearing was set for the next morning at the family courthouse. We arrived early, and Mom's lawyer organized all our exhibits in folders. Dad showed up with his lawyer, who immediately asked to speak to Judge Mayer. They went into her chambers and came back 10 minutes later. Dad's lawyer stood up and requested a continuance, saying they needed more time to prepare their defense. Judge Mayer looked at him over her glasses and said, "Child safety couldn't wait for convenience." She denied the continuance and said they would proceed immediately with the emergency custody matter only. Dad's face turned red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm to keep him quiet. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Mayer explained she would hear testimony about the events during the tornado. Mom's lawyer called me as the first witness. I walked to the stand carrying my folder of evidence and swore to tell the truth. Mom's lawyer had me start from the beginning with Halsey's first text about the tornado warning. I showed the screenshot with the timestamp and read it to the court. Then I showed my call log proving I called Dad multiple times and he hung up on me. I played the saved voicemail where I begged him to get Halsey to safety. Dad's lawyer objected, saying the voicemail was prejudicial, but Judge Mayer allowed it. I walked through each call I made trying to get help with printed screenshots as proof. I showed the weather service alerts proving the tornado was heading directly for Dad's house. I kept my voice calm and stuck to the facts just like we practiced. Dad's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to make me look like a jealous brother who wanted to control the family. He asked if I had any actual proof Dad locked Halsey upstairs. I said Janet's own text messages proved it. He asked if I was there to see what happened. I said no, but the evidence spoke for itself. He tried to twist my words, but I stuck to simple answers about what I knew for sure. Judge Mayer took notes the whole time and asked me to clarify a few timestamps. After an hour on the stand, I was dismissed and Leo was called next. Leo presented his evidence without any emotion or opinion. He showed the official Weather Service data, confirming an F3 tornado struck Dad's house at 9:03 p.m. He presented the 911 recordings of my calls begging for help. He showed the debris pattern analysis proving the second-floor bedrooms took a direct hit while the basement stayed mostly intact. Then he pulled out Janet's phone records showing her texts about being scared and wanting to go downstairs. He read each message with its timestamp, while Dad's lawyer frantically wrote notes. Leo presented photos from the scene showing Halsey's bedroom destroyed, while the basement had minimal damage. He testified that the evidence showed anyone in the basement would have known the danger upstairs. Judge Mayer asked several questions about the timeline, and Leo answered with precise facts. Dad's lawyer tried to object to the phone evidence, but Judge Mayer overruled him. Finally, Janet was called to testify. She walked to the stand looking pale and shaking. Mom's lawyer asked her to describe what happened that night. Janet started crying and said she was sorry. She admitted Dad told her to keep Halsey in her room no matter what. She said she stood in the hallway because Dad said Halsey was being dramatic about the storm. She confirmed hearing Halsey crying and begging to come downstairs. She said Dad threatened to call her defiant if she left her room. Janet admitted they only went to the basement after making sure Halsey couldn't follow. She said the video they made calling for Halsey was recorded after the tornado passed. Dad jumped up yelling that Janet was lying, but the bailiff made him sit down. Janet continued saying she was scared of Dad and did what he said. She admitted knowing it was wrong, but being too afraid to defy him. Mom's lawyer asked if Dad had threatened consequences for not following his orders. Janet said yes, and described how he'd extended Halsey's visits before as punishment. Judge Mayer had heard enough and called a recess to review the evidence. 20 minutes later, she returned and delivered her ruling. She suspended Dad's custody effective immediately. She ordered supervised visitation only with a court-approved monitor. She required Dad to complete parenting classes and undergo psychological evaluation. She issued a protection order for Halsey requiring Dad to stay away, except during supervised visits. She stated the evidence suggested criminal child endangerment, and she was referring the case to the prosecutor. She said Dad's actions during the tornado showed a complete disregard for Halsey's safety and well-being. Dad shot up from his seat so fast his chair fell backward. "This is insane!" His face turned red as he pointed at Judge Mayer. "She stayed in her room during a storm and now you're taking my daughter away?" The bailiff moved closer, but Dad kept yelling. "My parents raised me with rules and discipline and nobody called it abuse." Judge Mayer banged her gavel. "Mr. Blake, control yourself." Dad slammed his fist on the table. "You're destroying my life because I followed basic house rules." The bailiff grabbed Dad's arm, but he pulled away. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by my ex-wife." 2 more officers entered the courtroom. Dad saw them and got louder. "I protected my family by keeping everyone calm during that storm." Judge Mayer stood up. "Mr. Blake, you are in contempt of court." The officers surrounded Dad as he kept screaming about conspiracies and false accusations. They grabbed both his arms and started pulling him toward the door. "You'll regret this," Dad yelled at me as they dragged him past. "You've poisoned everyone against me!" I stayed completely still and silent in my seat, watching his mask finally slip off in front of everyone who mattered. The courtroom stayed quiet for several seconds after they removed him. Judge Mayer added the contempt charge to her written order and scheduled Dad's appearance for the following week. Outside the courthouse, Veronica pulled Mom and me aside near the parking garage. The media might pick this up because of the tornado angle. She handed us both business cards for a PR firm. "My advice is to stay quiet and protect Halsey's privacy during her recovery." Mom nodded immediately. "We don't want cameras at the hospital." I agreed, even though part of me wanted the whole world to know what Dad did. "The legal victory is what matters," Veronica said. "Focus on Halsey getting better, not public opinion." She was right, and we all knew it. Over the next few days, CPS put their safety plan into action while the hospital prepared Halsey's transfer to Riverside Rehabilitation Center. Joanna met with us to explain the monitoring protocols and supervised visit requirements. Mom and I worked out a schedule so one of us would always be there during Halsey's therapy sessions. The rehab facility was 40 minutes from town, but had the best spinal injury program in the state. Mom took morning shifts while I handled evenings after work. We synced our calendars and made backup plans for days when Mom had to travel. 3 weeks into rehab, I was watching Halsey work with her physical therapist when her left foot twitched. The therapist saw it too and called the doctor immediately. They ran tests for 2 hours while we waited in the hallway. Ahmad showed up with the results, cautiously smiling. The swelling has gone down enough that signals are getting through. He showed us the nerve conduction study. She moved her toes voluntarily. Halsey cried when they told her. The therapist adjusted her treatment plan to focus on building those connections. Months of work ahead, Ahmad warned, but this is very encouraging. We celebrated with ice cream from the cafeteria vending machine. 2 days later, Joanna called to tell us Janet had filed for divorce and moved out of Dad's house. She's cooperating fully with the prosecutor in exchange for immunity. Janet's lawyer sent a formal letter through proper channels. She admitted she was wrong and sorry for her role in what happened. She acknowledged blocking the hallway and following Dad's orders, even when she knew Halsey was in danger. The prosecutor used her testimony to strengthen the criminal case. Without Janet's income and with mounting legal bills, Dad's lawyer pushed him toward a plea deal. 6 weeks after the tornado, Dad accepted misdemeanor child endangerment charges to avoid a felony trial. The judge gave him 2 years probation, mandatory parenting classes, anger management counseling, and permanent loss of unsupervised custody rights. He'd have to complete all programs before even getting supervised visits. It wasn't the prison sentence I wanted, but it guaranteed Halsey's safety. Mom restructured her entire work situation after the tornado. She negotiated remote work 3 days a week and moved her California trips to monthly instead of weekly. H-Ear Company understood given the circumstances. We set up medical power of attorney so I could make decisions when Mom traveled. The three of us developed new routines around Halsey's therapy schedule. Mom handled insurance and medical paperwork, while I managed transportation and daily needs. 6 months after that terrible night, Halsey took her first steps with a cane in the rehab center's gym. She still needed support but grew stronger every day. Her determination impressed all the therapists. Dad completed half his required programs and had started supervised visits at a neutral location with a court monitor present. He stayed calm and followed all the rules, probably because his lawyer told him any violation would mean jail time. Mom attended every visit to support Halsey. I learned something important through all of this. My first instinct was to destroy Dad completely, to burn everything down for revenge. But working within the system, documenting everything, following proper channels, that's what actually protected Halsey. The legal victories meant more than any personal satisfaction I might have gotten from ruining him. Halsey was safe, Dad faced consequences, and our family could finally start healing the right way. That's all I've got this time. Honestly, I'm surprised you lasted to the end. Subscribe if you're into making bad decisions consistently.